Kofi Mensah was 42 years old when he saw his mother begging on the side of the road in Accra. That alone would have been enough to shatter a man. But Kofi's mother had been dead for 23 years. He had buried her. He had wept over her grave in the red dust of Kumasi. He had built his entire empire, 17 companies, for countries, a net worth of $2.3 billion on the foundation of her memory. Her face hung in a gold frame in every one of his boardrooms. Her name was carved in marble at the entrance of the hospital he built in her honor. Every school, every scholarship, every quiet act of generosity he had performed in the 2 decades since her funeral had been done in her name. Her name was Abina, and she was sitting on a piece of torn cardboard outside a fuel station on the Spintex Road, her hand stretched out toward passing cars, her wrapper faded, her feet bare, her face, that face he had memorized like scripture, turned toward the ground. Kofi's driver had to swerve to avoid another vehicle. The motorcade kept moving. But Kofi's heart had already stopped. He said one word: stop. What he would discover in the weeks that followed would not just break the man he had become. It would dismantle everything he believed about the boy he used to be. It would reveal a betrayal so calculated, so cold, so perfectly hidden for over 2 decades that the people closest to him had built their entire lives on top of his grief. And when the full truth finally surfaced, not in a boardroom, not in a court of law, but in a small room that smelled of groundnut soup and old wood, Kofi Mensah would have to decide what a man does when the foundation of his whole life turns out to be a lie. Before we go into this story, tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? And subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you absolutely cannot miss. The Mensah Tower rose 42 floors above the Accra skyline, its glass face catching the morning light off the Gulf of Guinea and throwing it back in sheets of gold. It was the kind of building that made people stop on the street and look up. The kind of building that reminded a city of what was possible when someone refused to stay small. Kofi stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of the top floor, holding a cup of sabalo, hibiscus tea, no sugar, the way his mother had always made it, and watching the city wake up below him. He had been awake since 4. He was always awake since 4. Sleep was something other people had time for. At 42, Kofi Mensah was a different species of wealthy from the men who appeared on the lists beside his name. He did not keep a yacht. He did not own a football club. He did not attend the kind of parties where people photographed each other's watches. He owned a modest house in East Legon, modest for a billionaire, meaning only 6 bedrooms, and he drove himself to the office on Tuesdays and Thursdays in a 10-year-old Land Cruiser that his head of security found personally offensive. His companies span logistics, agriculture, fintech, and real estate across Ghana, Nigeria, Côte d'Ivoire, and Rwanda. He employed over 14,000 people directly and touched the livelihoods of perhaps 10 times that number through his supply chains and contractor networks. He had appeared on 3 magazine covers and declined 30 more. He gave away, through a foundation bearing his mother's name, the Abina Mensah Foundation, approximately $40 million a year. Quietly, without press releases, without photo opportunities. This was the thing people who studied him always got wrong in their profiles. They would write about his business acumen, his timing, his instinct for markets. But they always missed the engine underneath all of it. Kofi Mensah built everything he built because of guilt. Not guilt about success. Not guilt about money. Guilt about his mother. He had been 19 years old and studying engineering on a government scholarship in Kumasi when the message came. His uncle Fifi, his mother's older brother, the family patriarch who had helped raise him after his father left, had called the dormitory phone at 7 in the morning. The connection was poor. The words came through like stones dropped into deep water. Your mother is gone, Kofi. It was her heart. She went in her sleep. She is at peace now. He remembered the exact quality of the light through the dormitory window that morning. He remembered the smell of Gary soaking in the pot his roommate had left on the table. He remembered sinking to the floor, still holding the receiver, unable to understand how the world could continue its noise around him when the most important person in it had simply stopped. He had come home for the funeral. He had stood at the graveside in his one good shirt, which was too tight across the shoulders because he had grown 3 inches since his mother bought it for him. He had watched the earth go over the simple coffin. He had held himself together by promising her, silently, over the fresh mound of red soil, that he would make something of himself. That her sacrifice would not be wasted. That her name would mean something. Uncle Fifi had stood beside him, his hand heavy on Kofi's shoulder. His Aunt Adwoa had wept loudly, the way women wept at funerals, performative and genuine at the same time. His cousins had been there, Fifi's children, Ernest and Cecilia, standing in the background in clean clothes that were better than Kofi's. He had returned to Kumasi 3 days later. He had finished his degree. He had taken the first job he could find, saved every sadie he could spare, borrowed what he could not spare, and built the first company from nothing but calculation and refusal. He had never once looked back at Kumasi with anything but sorrow. For 23 years, the grave of Kofi Mensah in the municipal cemetery on the outskirts of Kumasi had been tended by a groundskeeper Kofi paid handsomely and visited every year on the anniversary of her death. Fresh flowers. A moment of silence. Sometimes a few words spoken to the stone that marked her name. He had never questioned what was under that stone. The motorcade moved through Accra at 7:30 on a Wednesday morning in March. 3 vehicles, a quiet arrangement his security team had negotiated with him after the 3rd anonymous threat letter the previous year. Kofi had agreed to the motorcade the same way he agreed to most things he found unnecessary, without argument, without interest, his mind already elsewhere. He was reviewing acquisition documents on his tablet when the traffic slowed on Spintex Road. The fuel station on the left was busy. The morning commuters were forming their usual patient queue. And on the verge, beside a low concrete wall, a woman was sitting. She was elderly, perhaps 65 or 70, though poverty-aged people, and she could have been younger. She wore a faded Kent print wrapper that had once been bright and was now the color of something left too long in the sun. Her feet were bare and cracked. A small plastic bowl sat in front of her on the cardboard, holding a few coins. Her head was bowed, and her hand was extended toward the road with the particular patience of someone who had been doing this long enough that hope was no longer the point. Kofi's driver, Kwame, 24 years in his employ, was managing the traffic carefully, easing the SUV between a trotro and a delivery truck, when the woman raised her head. It was the angle. That was what did it. The precise angle at which she turned her face toward the morning light as a passing truck's draft lifted the edge of her wrapper. The jaw. The particular shape of the space between her cheekbone and her ear. The way her mouth sat, even in rest, slightly uneven on the left side from the tooth she had lost in her 30s, the one she had always laughed about replacing next month for as long as Kofi could remember. He had his mother's face memorized the way other people memorized prayers. He had looked at it in photographs for 23 years. He had looked at it in his own face in mirrors, tracing the inheritance in his brow and his forehead and the line of his nose. He knew that face. "Stop," he said. Kwame stopped. "Sir?" Kwame turned, reading something in Kofi's stillness that he did not understand but recognized as important. Kofi was already opening the door. He walked across the verge without thinking about what he was doing. His head of security, Joseph, was out of the lead vehicle and moving toward him before Kofi had taken 5 steps, but Kofi raised one hand without turning around and Joseph stopped. 20 years of reading that hand had taught him what it meant. The woman had not looked up. She was staring at the ground with the practiced inwardness of the very poor, who learn not to watch people approach because the watching and the hoping and the disappointment is its own kind of exhaustion. Kofi crouched in front of her. He was a tall man and crouching brought him to her level. He looked at her face from 18 inches away. The world did not stop. The traffic continued its noise. A hawker moved past with a tray of sachets balanced on his head, calling out in Twi. The morning smelled of exhaust and fresh bread from somewhere nearby. The woman's eyes came up. They were his mother's eyes. Tired in a way that went past tired, into something that had given up arguing with itself. But they were the same eyes. The same particular brown, almost amber in direct light. The same shape, heavier on the left lid than the right, a thing he had never seen on another face in 42 years. She looked at him the way the very poor sometimes look at the obviously wealthy, with a guard that was both deferential and self-protective, waiting to be moved along, waiting to be pitted and then ignored. She did not recognize him. Kofi found that he could not speak. He was a man who had sat across tables from presidents and held his composure. He had lost a deal worth $300 million in a single afternoon without changing his expression. He had been told, twice, that companies he had built from nothing were effectively worthless, and both times he had simply asked for the detailed numbers and started calculating the recovery. But kneeling in the red dust of a Spintex Road verge, looking into the eyes of his dead mother, Kofi Mensah could not find a single word. He placed a hand on hers. Her hand was rough, the knuckles enlarged. She flinched. "Mame," he said. "Mother." She stared at him, and something in her face, something old and locked and buried beneath layers of whatever had happened to her, moved. Just slightly, like the first shift in earth before a structure gives way. Then she looked down again. "I don't know you," she said, in Twi, her voice low and flat. "Please. I am not begging for much. Just leave me." Kofi did not take her to the hospital that morning, though every instinct in him wanted to. He understood, with the precise emotional intelligence that 20 years of reading people in negotiation had built in him, that to move too fast would be to lose her. She was a woman who had learned to distrust the sudden kindness of strangers. Whatever had brought her to that piece of cardboard had not happened quickly. He had Joseph arrange for a woman from his foundation's field team, Afia, who worked community outreach in low-income areas and knew how to sit quietly with people who had been broken, to approach the woman and speak with her in Twi. Not to bring her anywhere, just to sit, to offer food, to listen. He sat in the vehicle 300 meters down the road and waited. His hands were folded in his lap. His tablet lay forgotten on the seat beside him. He had not moved for 40 minutes. Kwame, who had worked for Kofi since the man was 23 years old and had never once asked a personal question, looked in the rearview mirror and said quietly, "Sir, do you need anything?" "No," Kofi said. "Thank you, Kwame." Another 15 minutes passed. Afia's voice came through his phone. "She says her name is Abina. She is from Kumasi. She has been in Accra for about 2 months. She doesn't want to say more right now, but she accepted the food." Kofi closed his eyes for exactly 3 seconds. Then he opened them. "Tell her," he said carefully, "that there is a guest house nearby where she can rest. No pressure. No obligation. Tell her a man would like to speak with her, and he will explain who he is when she is ready. Tell her she is safe." A pause on the line. "She is asking who the man is." Kofi considered this. "Tell her his name is Kofi. Tell her his mother's name was Abina, too." He heard the words relayed in Twi. He heard a silence on the other end that lasted a very long time. Then, faintly in the background, he heard a sound he had not heard in 23 years. A sound so specific to one person that his entire body recognized it before his mind did. The short, involuntary sound his mother had made when something surprised her past the capacity of words. A small, compressed syllable, half breath, half voice. When Afia spoke again, her own voice had changed. "Sir," she said, "she is asking me to repeat your name." He did not go to her immediately. He gave her 2 days at the guest house, with Afia checking in gently each morning. On the 3rd day, she agreed to meet him. They sat in a small sitting room with the afternoon light coming through louved windows. She wore a new wrapper that Afia had quietly provided. Her feet were clean. She had eaten properly for 3 days, and some of the worst exhaustion had left her face, which made her look both better and worse. Better because she was less diminished, worse because without the vacancy of extreme hunger, she looked more fully like herself, and looking more fully like herself made the reality of her more completely impossible. She sat across from him, hands folded in her lap, watching him with an expression he could not read. Kofi was wearing a simple Kent print shirt and trousers. No watch. No driver waiting outside. He had come alone in the old Land Cruiser. Whatever this was, it was not a meeting for witnesses. He reached into the folder he had brought and placed a photograph on the table between them. It was from his files, the Foundation's materials, a photograph of Abina Mensah, his mother, taken when she was perhaps 35 years old. He had hundreds of them. He looked at this one, every day. The woman across from him looked at the photograph for a long time. Her hands, still folded in her lap, tightened against each other. "Where did you get this?" she said. "It is my mother," Kofi said. "She died in 1999. I buried her in Kumasi." The woman's eyes came up to his. In them, behind everything that had accumulated there, the fatigue, the wariness, the particular armor of someone who has learned that the world is not to be trusted, he saw something else. Something old and agonized, and still somehow alive. "You're Kofi," she said. "Yes." "Ajoa's boy," she said, and her voice broke on the second word in a way that was nothing like performance. "The one who used to bring her pawpaw from the market because she said the ones from the garden were too bitter." There were details in that sentence that existed in no photograph, no foundation document, no article written about him. Details that lived only in his own memory and in the memory of whoever had stood in that kitchen with him and his mother when he was 12 years old. Kofi Mensah, the man who had not cried in the presence of another human being since he was 19 years old standing over a grave in Kumasi, put his face in his hands. Her name was Abina Darko, born Abina Boteng, who had married a man named Mensah and had one son named Kofi before that husband left and never came back, which she had absorbed as simply another thing the world did without explanation. She had not died in 1999. She told him the story quietly, without performance, in the flat voice of someone who had rehearsed the facts many times alone and had arrived at the stage beyond anger, in the territory of pure exhausted truth. In 1999, she had been ill, genuinely ill, a cardiac condition that the district hospital in Kumasi had diagnosed and told her might require surgery she could not afford. She had told no one except her brother Fifi because she did not want her son, in his first year of university, to abandon his studies to come home and worry about her. What happened next she had not understood for a long time. She had been in the hospital for 4 days when Fifi came to see her. He told her the doctors had found something additional, something serious, and that she needed rest and quiet, away from Kumasi, away from any stress. He said he had arranged for her to stay with a cousin in Takoradi for several months while she recovered. He said he would explain everything to Kofi. She had been sick and frightened, and she had trusted her older brother the way people trust the adults who shaped them, with the specific faith that does not ask for evidence. She had gone to Takoradi. The cousin was a woman she barely knew, a distant connection, not warm, not unkind, simply a stranger who had been paid to provide a room. Fifi visited once in the first month, told her she was still too unwell to contact Kofi, told her the boy was being cared for, told her to rest. Then he stopped visiting. Her letters to Kofi, sent to the dormitory address she had, went unanswered. When she was strong enough to travel back to Kumasi, 6 months later, the house she had lived in was occupied by another family. It took her 2 more years of searching, of slowly rebuilding from nothing in a city where she knew no one, to find out what Fifi had done. He had told Kofi she was dead. She had discovered this not from Fifi himself, who had by then relocated to Accra and who, when she eventually reached him on a borrowed phone, told her to stay away from Kofi, told her she would ruin his future, told her the boy was doing well and her interference would only damage him, but from a woman in the old neighborhood who had attended the funeral that Fifi had apparently organized. A small affair, she was told. A simple coffin. The family had gathered. There had been a grave, with her name on it, and her son had stood over it and wept. And by that time, Fifi had moved into the role of the family patriarch in Kofi's life with the smooth efficiency of someone who had planned this carefully, who understood that a young man without a mother was a young man available to be guided, and guided meant controlled, and controlled meant useful. Kofi drove home alone after that meeting. He sat in the driveway of his East Legon house for 22 minutes without getting out of the car. He was doing what he always did with devastating information. He was mapping it, finding the edges, identifying the structural load-bearing points of the lie so he could understand what had been built on top of it. Because Fifi had not simply sent his mother away and told a grieving boy she was dead. That was not the whole of what had happened. And Kofi, with 20 years of building companies, reading contracts, and understanding the way people position themselves for long-term extraction, knew that no one organized a fake funeral without a plan for what came after. He went inside. He opened his laptop. He did not call anyone that night. He needed to understand the architecture before he started pulling at the walls. By 3 a.m, the picture had begun to assemble itself. Uncle Fifi, Emmanuel Asante Asidu, 67 years old, currently resident in the airport residential area of Accra, had been in Kofi's life in a particular way since the fake funeral. Not an absent uncle, not a marginal figure. He had positioned himself as the family elder that Kofi reported to, leaned on, and in the early years especially, deferred to. He had been the one to advise Kofi on the first investment, on the first company registration, on the first property purchase. He had been in the room, or adjacent to it, at enough key moments that his signature was woven through the early history of everything Kofi had built. He had taken, over 23 years, what Kofi's accountant would later calculate to be a little under $14 million in various forms. Advisory fees that were never commensurate with advice actually given. A land deal in which Kofi was the buyer and Fifi was, undisclosed, the seller's agent. Shares in an early company that had been issued at a preferential rate under the justification of family loyalty. Loans that had been repaid in form but never in substance, being rolled into new arrangements that kept the principal indefinitely in Fifi's orbit. None of it individually would have been enough to convict him of anything. All of it together was a careful, patient, decades-long extraction from a young man who had been made to need a family elder, precisely because his mother had been removed. But the money was not what kept Kofi awake until 4 a.m. What kept him awake was a question he could not yet answer. His cousin Ernest, Fifi's son, Kofi's childhood companion, now a businessman in his 40s with a comfortable life in Tima, had been present at the fake funeral, had stood at the graveside, had wept. Had Ernest known? And his cousin Cecilia, Fifi's daughter, who had been Kofi's closest friend among the cousins, who had written him letters during his first years at university, who had visited him in Accra twice in the early days when he was building the first company and barely had money for food. Had she known? Had they all known? The next morning he called one person. His oldest friend, Daniel Asante, no relation to the Asidu family, who had been his roommate in the Kumasi dormitory and who was now a physician with a practice in Accra. Daniel was the only person besides his lawyers who knew the full financial picture of Kofi's life, and the only person in the world Kofi trusted with anything that mattered. He told Daniel everything in one unbroken recitation. He used the same voice he used in board meetings. The same even cadence. Daniel was quiet for a long time. "How sure are you?" Daniel asked. "I am completely sure," Kofi said. "I need a doctor's assessment. She needs a full medical evaluation gently done. I need to know her actual state of health and I need it documented." "I'll come this afternoon," Daniel said. Kofi. A pause. "How are you?" "I am mapping it," Kofi said. Daniel knew what that meant. "All right," he said. "I'll come at 3. After he put down the phone, Kofi sat for a moment looking at the framed photograph of his mother on his desk. The gold frame. The image he had looked at every working day for 23 years, the image that was the foundation of everything he told himself about who he was and why he worked and what the point of any of it was. He had been running on a grief that was a lie. He had built an empire on a grave that contained no one. He had poured $40 million a year in charitable giving for 19 years through a foundation named for a woman who was alive, who was hungry, who was sitting on a piece of cardboard on the Spintex Road, while the foundation that bore her name funded scholarships for other people's children. He did not feel anger yet. He was not there yet. What he felt was the specific vertigo of a man who has been standing on what he believed was solid ground, and has just looked down. Daniel's assessment was thorough, compassionate, and complete. Abina was 66 years old. Kofi had estimated older, and the correction landed with its own particular tenderness, because it meant she had been 43 when Fifi sent her away, not old, not frail, a healthy middle-aged woman removed from her life by calculation. She had moderate osteoarthritis, some cardiac irregularities consistent with the original condition that had never been properly treated, mild malnutrition from the preceding months, and the general physical record of a woman who had spent 2 decades living close to poverty with inadequate access to health care. She was not dying. She was not beyond recovery. With proper care, Daniel said carefully, there was no reason she should not have years of good health ahead of her. When Daniel said this, Kofi excused himself, walked to the bathroom of the guest house, and stood over the sink with the cold water running, breathing. He gave himself 4 minutes. Then he walked back out and resumed the conversation with the same steady face. That evening, Abina agreed to move into a proper apartment that Kofi arranged through his foundation's housing program. She did not yet know the scale of what he had built, and he was careful about how much he revealed at once, reading her the way he read any situation that required precision timing. He did not want to overwhelm her. He did not want the weight of what he was about to give back to crush the small, careful thing they were rebuilding. But before he left that evening, she called him back. Kofi, she said, from the doorway. She was using his name experimentally, like a word in a language she was relearning. He turned. Your uncle told me, she said carefully, that you had a good life, that you were doing well, that you did not need me making things complicated.
She paused.
Is that true? That you were doing well? He looked at his mother, alive, standing upright, speaking to him in her own voice, and the answer he gave was the most honest one he had ever spoken in 42 years. I was doing very well, he said. And none of it meant what I thought it meant. We will fix that. He spent 10 days doing what he did when a problem needed to be understood before it could be moved against. He gathered information with the patience of someone who knew that premature action was the enemy of complete consequence. His head of legal affairs, a formidable woman named Serwa Addo who had spent 18 years dismantling the contracts of people who thought they were untouchable, began a quiet review of every financial arrangement in which Fifi's name or interests appeared. She worked from a sealed brief. She told no one what she was looking for. Separately, Kofi had a private investigator, a former Interpol analyst named Kwabena Asare, who worked exclusively for Kofi's office on matters requiring discretion, begin assembling a full accounting of Fifi's financial history. Not just what had flowed between them, but the broader picture. What had Fifi built in the 23 years since the fake funeral? The answer, when it arrived a week later in a detailed report, was quite a lot. Fifi owned 4 properties in Accra, all acquired in the past 15 years. He had a stake in a construction company in Kumasi that had received 3 government contracts that, Kofi's investigator noted with clinical precision, had been bid at prices substantially above market and awarded without competitive process, during a period when one of the ministry officials involved had been a frequent guest at events organized by one of Fifi's business associates. He had a joint account with his son Ernest that showed regular inflows from a consulting firm that, on examination, had no clients, no employees, and no office, the kind of structure that existed for the singular purpose of moving money in a form that looked like income. And he had, held in a trust registered in his daughter Cecilia's name, a residential property in Kumasi. The property was on a street Kofi recognized immediately when he saw the address. It was the street where his mother's house had stood. The house that had been occupied by another family when Abina returned from Takoradi in 2001. Fifi had taken the house. He had transferred it to himself, presumably with forged documents or through the specific corruption of a land registry clerk who had not asked enough questions, and he had held it for several years before selling it and using the proceeds as the deposit on one of his Accra properties. Kofi read this in his office on a Tuesday evening with the city lights beginning to come on outside. He set down the report. He picked up his sabalo. He drank it slowly. He thought about the day he had stood at the graveside at 19 years old and promised his mother he would make something of himself. He thought about all the years of work that had followed, the years of 6-hour nights and 18-hour days, the deals won and lost, the slow accumulation of something real from nothing. He thought about the $40 million a year that had gone out under her name into hospitals and schools and scholarships. He thought about the hospital he had built in Kumasi and named for her. He thought about her name carved in marble at the entrance, which she had never seen, which she did not know existed. He set down the cup. He picked up his phone. He called Serwa. How long do you need? He asked. Another week, Serwa said. To be thorough. Take 10 days, Kofi said. Be thorough. He put down the phone and looked out at the city. He was not angry. He wanted to be precise about this in his own mind. What he felt was not anger. Anger was a feeling that pushed you toward fast action, toward saying the thing that felt good instead of the thing that landed correctly. What he felt was something older and colder than anger. Something that required patience. Something that intended to be permanent. Meanwhile, he spent time with his mother. Not grand time, not programmatic time.
Small time.
They ate together in the evenings at the apartment he had arranged. She made groundnut soup on the small stove the second week, because she said the catering service, though excellent, did not know how to let the pepper develop properly. The smell of it filled the apartment, and Kofi sat at the table and watched her at the stove and could not speak for several minutes. She told him pieces of the past 23 years in no particular order, as memory surfaced, not as a complete narrative, but as fragments. The job she had found in Takoradi washing clothes for a family for 7 years. The small room she had rented in a compound house in Swaim, back in Kumasi, after she finally saved enough to return. The market stall she had run for 11 years selling vegetables, which had been good for a while, and then less good as her joints began to trouble her. The slow slide, after the stall became unsustainable, toward the kinds of casual labor that dries up an older woman, carrying loads, washing, whatever was available. She told these things without self-pity. She was not a self-pitying woman. Kofi remembered this about her from when he was small, how she had always described difficulty in practical terms, as problems to be solved or survived, never as injustices to be mourned. He had inherited this from her. He had simply never known until now where it came from. She asked him, one evening, what he did. He had been careful about this, revealing it in layers. He told her about the first company, then the growth. He watched her face move through expressions she was trying to control. When he told her about the foundation, her name on it, her name in marble, her name in the letterheads of 23 years of charitable work, she put her spoon down and looked at the table for a long time. I am glad, she said finally. That good came from something bad. She paused. But I want you to know that it would have been enough just to have you. Kofi looked at his mother and realized he was going to have to excuse himself again. He asked her about Ernest and Cecilia carefully, over several conversations, not pressing, leaving space. She told him that Ernest had visited her once, years ago, in Takoradi. She had managed to get a message to him through an old neighbor. He had come, seen her, and told her that it was complicated, that Kofi was doing well and building something important, that disrupting things would not be kind. He had left her some money. He had not come again. She did not know if Cecilia had known. She did not think so. Cecilia had been 15 at the time of the fake funeral, a child who would have been told what her father told her. But she could not be certain. Kofi added this to his map. Ernest had known. Ernest had seen her. Ernest had made a choice, not a passive choice, not the choice of ignorance, but an active choice to leave her and say nothing. Ernest had sat across from Kofi at birthdays and business dinners for 20 years, had accepted Kofi's help when his own business struggled, had stood as a groomsman at the wedding of a man whose mother he knew was alive, and sitting in Takoradi, with enough money for rent, but not enough for hope. He thought about Ernest's face. He thought about what it must have cost to maintain that over 2 decades, or whether it had cost anything at all. The second possibility was worse. Serwa delivered her final brief on a Thursday morning. Kofi read it at his desk, uninterrupted, for 2 hours. When he finished, he asked her 3 questions, received 3 precise answers, and then asked her to prepare the documents he described. She did not ask for an explanation. She had worked for him for 18 years, and she understood that when he spoke with that particular quietness, explanations were a courtesy he would provide later. He also, that week, had a conversation with a journalist he trusted, Abina Owusu, no relation, a senior editor at a respected Ghanaian publication who had covered his business dealings over the years with accuracy and fairness, and who understood the distinction between a story that needed to be told and a story that needed to be performed. He did not give her anything yet. He explained the outline of what he had found and told her he would call her when the time was right. She agreed to wait. He called Daniel and told him he was ready. All of it at once? Daniel asked. Yes, Kofi said. That is the only way to do it cleanly. You pull one wall at a time, and the people inside have time to move their valuables. The meeting was arranged for the following Saturday. A family gathering, ostensibly. Kofi hosted these occasionally in the house in East Legon when there was something to celebrate or something to acknowledge. He invited Fifi. He invited Ernest. He invited Cecilia and her husband. He invited 3 other cousins who were peripheral to the central betrayal but whose presence would matter for what came after. He invited Daniel as his personal guest. He also invited, quietly and separately, Sirwa Addo and his investigator Kwabena, who would be present not as guests, but as professionals with documents. He arranged for his mother to be brought to the house at a particular moment in the proceedings. Not at the beginning. Not until the right time. He had thought carefully about whether to include her. He had asked her. She had said, without hesitation, that she wanted to be there. She had said it with the specific tone of a woman who had been patient for 23 years and had arrived at the end of that patience. He respected that. The Saturday arrived overcast, which Kofi found appropriate. The house in East Legon had a large garden that his landscaper kept impeccably, and the staff had arranged the reception area with the understated elegance that Kofi's household operated by as a matter of course. Food was prepared. Drinks were arranged. Fifi arrived first, as senior elder, which was his habit and his privilege. He was a heavy-set man who had aged with a kind of prosperous ease, well-dressed, comfortable in his body, with the practiced warmth of someone who had spent decades being well-regarded. He embraced Kofi with genuine-seeming affection. He smelled of a good cologne. His handshake was firm. "My son," he said. He had called Kofi his son for 23 years. "Uncle," Kofi said. His voice was warm. His face showed nothing. Ernest arrived next, then Cecilia and her husband Kwame, then the other cousins in ones and twos. The gathering settled into the comfortable rhythms of family. Food passed, conversations beginning, children running in the garden. Fifi held court in the sitting room, as he always did, with the ease of a man who expected to be listened to. Kofi moved through the gathering attending to guests, speaking to each person warmly and normally. He was a gracious host. He was always a gracious host. No one in the room, watching him, would have read anything in his bearing beyond the ordinary pleasure of a man gathering his people. At 3 in the afternoon, when the food had been eaten and the conversations had settled into the comfortable mid-afternoon pace, Kofi asked everyone to gather in the main sitting room. He said he had something to share with them. They assembled with the mild curiosity of a family expecting an announcement. Perhaps a new business. Perhaps a philanthropic milestone. Kofi was known for these moments of generosity. He stood at the front of the room, hands clasped, looking at the assembled faces. "I want to start," he said, "by saying that everything I have built in my life, I built in my mother's name. Most of you know this. Many of you were there at the beginning. I want to acknowledge that, and I want to acknowledge all of you for being part of what this family has meant to me." Heads nodded. Fifi, on the best chair in the room, inclined his head with the satisfied dignity of the senior elder being properly acknowledged. 23 years ago, Kofi continued, in the same even voice, "I was told my mother died. I buried her. And everything I built as a response to that loss." He paused. "I need to tell you that I found my mother 3 weeks ago. She was alive. She had been alive all along." The room changed. This was not dramatic in the movies. Sudden gasps, chairs knocked over. It was quieter than that. It was the specific change in a room when the thing everyone understood to be true is quietly removed from underneath them. Ernest's face went still in a way that was different from surprise. Fifi's comfortable posture, for the first time, slightly shifted. "She will be joining us in a few minutes," Kofi said. "I wanted to give you a moment to understand what I am telling you before she comes in." Cecilia's hand had gone to her mouth. Her eyes, Kofi noted, held genuine shock. This mattered. He had been watching for it. The door opened. Kofi Mensah walked in slowly, with the careful dignity of a woman who has had to relearn how to occupy space after years of making herself invisible. She wore a wrapper in deep blue and gold that Kofi had quietly arranged, not expensive enough to feel performative, fine enough to say that she was cared for. Her hair was done. She stood upright. She looked at her family. The sound that came from Cecilia was not a word. It was a recognition, the specific involuntary sound of someone seeing something their body accepts as true before their mind has processed it. She was out of her chair and across the room before anyone else had moved, and she held Abina's hands and looked at her face and wept without embarrassment, without control, the weeping of someone for whom the grief had been real and who was now having it returned to them without warning. Abina, for her part, touched Cecilia's face with both hands and said her name softly. This, Kofi observed, confirmed what he had hoped. Cecilia had not known. Cecilia had mourned. Cecilia was not part of this. Fifi had not moved. Ernest had not moved. They watched the reunion with the specific stillness of men who are rapidly calculating. Kofi gave the room its minutes. He was not in a hurry. He watched his mother and his cousin hold each other, and he watched his uncle and Ernest from across the room, and he did not move and did not look away. When the first wave of emotion had settled, Kofi spoke again. I have spent the past 3 weeks understanding what happened. I have a full account of it now, documented and verified. I am going to share it with this family, not because I want to cause pain, but because I think everyone in this room deserves to know the truth about who they have been trusting and what was done to all of us. He nodded to Serwa, who had been standing quietly at the side of the room. Serwa set documents on the table. He took them through it without emotion. That was deliberate. He had thought carefully about this. Emotion would allow Fifi to reframe the moment as a family argument, as a son's grief distorting his judgment, as something that could be managed with the tools of patriarchal authority that Fifi had been wielding for decades. Precision denied him those tools. He went through the chronology of 1999, the illness, the removal to Takoradi, the fake funeral. He presented the testimony of the woman from the old neighborhood who had attended the funeral and confirmed its staging. He presented the records showing the Kamasi house had been transferred out of his mother's name through documents whose provenance was, to say the least, irregular. He presented the financial record. Every transaction, every advisory fee, every preferential share allocation, every loan that had transformed itself through accounting creativity into something that never quite needed to be repaid. $14 million over 23 years, laid out in a table that Serwa had prepared with accountant's clarity, each entry dated, each entry sourced. He presented the record of the Kamasi construction contracts, the relationships, the timing, the pricing. He presented the consulting company that had no purpose except to receive money. He presented a single additional document, the record of Ernest's visit to Takoradi in 2003, the money he had left, the years of silence that followed. Throughout this recitation, Fifi said nothing. This was, Kofi noted, the response of a man who had been calculating since Abina walked through the door and had arrived at the conclusion that denial was not available to him and that silence was therefore the only viable position. Ernest, when the Takoradi document was placed on the table, looked at his hands. When Kofi had finished, the room was completely quiet. Cecilia, who had not let go of Abina's hand, looked at her father with an expression that Kofi could not name because he had never seen it on a human face before, the specific look of someone who has, in a single afternoon, discovered that the person who shaped them is someone they do not recognize and possibly never knew. Kofi picked up the last document from Serwa's stack and held it. I am not going to the police, he said. That is a decision I have made. Not from mercy. From priority. My priority is my mother. Not punishment. Not visibility. Not the performance of justice. He paused. But I am going to be very clear about what happens now. He set the document on the table. It was an agreement, prepared by Serwa, that Fifi and Ernest would sign before leaving the house. It contained 3 components: a formal acknowledgement of the financial fraud and the sum involved, a transfer of the 4 Kra properties into a trust managed by Kofi's foundation, and a legal undertaking to have no further contact with Kofi, his mother, or his business interests, with penalties that Serwa had written with characteristic thoroughness. There was a separate clause specifically for Ernest, a repayment schedule for the assistance Kofi had given his business over the years, which Kofi had calculated to the cent, and which would go directly into the Kofi Mensah Foundation's Community Health Fund. If you do not sign, Kofi said, I will refer the complete documented record to the relevant authorities, and I will give the full account to a journalist who has been waiting for my call for 3 weeks. Fifi found his voice for the first time since Abina had entered the room.
Kofi, he said.
The word carried layers: appeal, authority, the residue of decades of positioning himself as the elder whose word ended arguments. You're talking about family. You're talking about your own blood. Whatever mistakes were made, you cannot. You organized a funeral for a living woman, Kofi said, and his voice had not changed at all. It was still level, still quiet, still completely steady. You told a 19-year-old boy that his mother was dead, and you stood at the graveside, and you watched him weep. Then you stepped into the space her death created, and you used it for 23 years. He paused for exactly 1 second. Do not speak to me about family. Fifi did not speak again. Ernest picked up the pen. His hand was not steady.
He signed.
After a long moment in which the assembled family watched him, Fifi reached for the pen. His hand, Kofi noted, was completely steady. This was a man who had been maintaining composure in difficult rooms for a very long time. He signed without looking up. Serwa collected the documents with her customary efficiency. Kofi looked at his uncle, the man who had stood at his mother's fake graveside, the man who had called him my son for 23 years, the man who had shaped the grief that shaped the empire, and felt the last thing he had expected to feel. Not satisfaction, not relief, just the deep, structural sense of a weight finally counted accurately, of knowing, at last, exactly what had been held, by whom, for how long, and at what cost. You can go, Kofi said. He did not call the journalist that day. He waited 1 week, and then he called Abina Owusu and told her she could write the story of the foundation, not the betrayal, not yet, not until he decided whether that needed to be public, but the story of his mother. The story of Kofi Mensah, alive, the woman in whose name $40 million a year had been quietly changing lives while she herself had been invisible. The story of the son who had found her. Abina Owusu, who had been a journalist for 22 years and who had covered stories of every magnitude, was quiet for a moment on the phone when Kofi had finished the outline. Then she said, "This is the most important story I will ever write." He told her to write it well. The article ran 3 weeks later. It ran without the details of Fifi's betrayal. Kofi had made his decision. The legal consequences would be handled through the signed agreement and through quiet pressure where necessary, but he was not going to use his mother's life as public fuel for a revenge narrative. She deserved better than to have her story told as a scandal. Her story was not about what had been done to her. It was about who she was. The response to the article was not what Kofi had expected because he had not thought much about the response. He had not written it for response. But the story moved through the country and then beyond it with the specific velocity that real things move, not the velocity of performance or sensation, but the steadier, more durable speed of something that is simply and completely true. Kofi moved his mother into a house in Labwan. Not the East Legon house, which was his working life, but a house he bought specifically for her, chosen in part because it had a large garden with good soil and a kitchen with a window that faced east, which she said she preferred for the morning light when she cooked. He hired a household helper for her, a woman named Adwoa who was warm and capable and who his mother had approved on the basis of a single conversation. He visited 3 times a week, sometimes more. They had the meals he had thought about during the 23 years he had thought she was gone. The groundnut soup, the Contamire stew, the light soup with goat meat that she made at New Year. She asked him, one evening when they were sitting on the veranda watching the garden go dark with the early onset of the harmattan, whether he had been very angry. He told her the truth. He said he had felt many things but had tried to keep anger in its proper position, acknowledged but not in charge.
Your father was like that too, she said.
The reasonable ones are the hardest to fight with. She was quiet for a moment. He was not a bad man, your father. He was just a man who had not decided yet. Some people never decide. This was the most she had said about his father. Kofi did not press. He understood that her life, like his, had been built in a particular shape by losses that had never been fully accounted for, and that accounting for them was work that would take time and would not be rushed. I have been thinking, she said, about the foundation. The hospital in Kumasi. Yes. I would like to see it, if you think that is appropriate. She paused, with the careful diffidence of someone still relearning her own entitlements. It has my name on it. I feel I should at least see what my name looks like on a building. Kofi looked at his mother. He felt something he did not have a word for, but which lived in the chest below language. I will take you next month, he said. The trip to Kumasi was arranged on a clear day in early May. Kofi drove, in the old Land Cruiser. He did not want a motorcade for this. He did not want it to feel like an occasion. He wanted it to feel like a son taking his mother somewhere. They passed through Kumasi and drove to the municipal cemetery before going to the hospital. He had thought about this. He had decided she should know. The grave was real. The headstone was real, carved with her name and dates that were wrong but had been maintained for 23 years with fresh flowers and faithful attention by a groundskeeper who had never been told anything except that this was the grave of the employer's mother and it was to be cared for. Abina stood at the grave for a long time. She read her own name on the stone. She read the dates. She looked at the flowers that had been there since his last visit. You came here every year, she said. Yes. She was quiet. All of it, she said finally, for something that wasn't true. Not quite, Kofi said. The grief was true. The love was true. Those went somewhere real. We just didn't know yet where to put them. She turned and looked at him. He had grown into her face. She could see it now, the continuity of him, the way a child who is truly loved carries the evidence of that love into the person they become. She had thought for 23 years that she had given him nothing, that she had been taken away before she could finish what she started. Looking at her son, she understood that she had finished more than she knew. She put her hand in his. They stood at her empty grave in the morning light, in the quiet that comes after long things have been said, and they remained there until she was ready to leave. The Kofi Mensah Foundation Hospital occupied a full city block on the edge of Kumasi's medical district. It was a well-built, graceful building, not ostentatious, functional and permanent, with the architectural character of something meant to serve for a long time. 312 beds, a cardiac unit, a maternal health center, a pediatric ward that Kofi had always been particularly proud of, which was painted in warm colors because someone had told him, correctly, that color mattered to sick children. At the entrance, in the marble pillar beside the main doors, the name was carved in letters that were large enough to be clear and small enough not to shout. Kofi Mensah Foundation Hospital in honor of a woman who gave everything she had. Abina stood in front of the letters and read them. She read them for a long time. A young nurse passed through the entrance doors, nodded respectfully to Kofi, and went on her way. An elderly man was being helped from a vehicle at the entrance by a family member. A woman with a child waited on the bench by the door. The ordinary life of the place moved around them. Abina reached out and traced the letters of her name with her fingertips. The marble was warm from the morning sun. A woman who gave everything she had. She read aloud, quietly. Yes, Kofi said. I didn't give everything, she said. I was taken away before I could. No, Kofi said, and his voice was steady, but something in it had finally found the boundary of what steadiness could hold. You gave me the first 7 years. You gave me the person I was when I walked into that dormitory with nothing. You gave me the thing that made me build instead of quit. Everything here, he gestured, and the gesture took in not just the building but the 23 years behind it, the 40 million a year, the 14,000 employees, all of it. Everything here started with what you gave me in the first 7 years. He paused. I just didn't know you were still here to receive it. His mother took his hand. Not with the tentative touch of the woman on the cardboard at the fuel station. With the full, decided grip of a mother holding her son's hand. She held it for a moment. Then she looked up at the building that bore her name, the building full of people being helped, the building that existed because grief can be turned into something useful if you refuse to let it make you small. Well, she said, in the practical tone that was hers and always had been, the tone he had inherited without knowing its source, we had better go in then. I want to see what my name built. The Kofi Mensah Foundation issued its annual report on a Thursday in October, which was the same day it always issued its annual report. The numbers were what they had always been: the schools, the scholarships, the hospitals, the community health initiatives, the microfinance programs that had quietly changed the material circumstances of thousands of families across 4 countries. There was one addition. A new program line had been inserted into the Foundation's activities: the Kofi Mensah Reentry Initiative, a program for older women emerging from extended poverty, providing housing support, healthcare access, skills training, and community connection. The program had enrolled 47 women in its first operating quarter. It was expected to reach 200 in its first year. The program's founding story was included in the annual report. One paragraph. No names beyond Abina's. No dramatics. Just the fact of it. A woman had been lost. She had been found. And in the finding, she had become not just the name on the building but the reason for a new door. Kofi sat at his desk on the morning the report was distributed, drinking his sabalo, looking at the city below. He was the same man he had always been in the external signs: the 4th-floor office, the old Land Cruiser on Tuesdays and Thursdays, the simple Kent shirt, the quiet manner that new employees sometimes mistook for coldness until they understood it better. But something in the architecture of him had shifted. It was not a dramatic shift. It was the shift that happens when a load that has been wrongly distributed is finally placed correctly, a settling, a truing, a structural accuracy that the whole building benefits from without any individual part needing to announce it. He thought about the woman who had shaped him. He thought about the 19-year-old boy at the graveside who had made a promise to a grave that held no one, and had kept that promise for 23 years because the love behind it was real even when the object of it had been taken away by someone who had calculated that grief was easier to manage than a living person. He thought about what it meant that the grief had been pointed in the right direction all along, even when it was pointed at an empty grave. He thought about the particular mercy of that love, misdirected, still finds its way to the shape of the thing it loves. His phone buzzed. A message from a number he now had saved under its proper name. "I made Contemeyer this morning.
Come for lunch if you can."
He typed back a single word. Coming.
He closed his laptop.
He picked up his keys. He walked out of the building that bore his name into the Accra morning, past the cars and the hawkers and the ordinary noise of a city that did not know and did not need to know what he carried. He drove to his mother's house in Labwan, where the garden was doing well and the kitchen window faced east, and the smell of something real cooking on a stove reached him before he had finished parking the car. He had built an empire on grief. Now he was learning something harder and better and more durable than grief. He was learning that his mother was alive. And that some things, if you are patient enough and careful enough and refuse to let the people who stole them make the final definition of what they were worth, some things can be returned. Not everything taken stays gone. And not every foundation built on sorrow has to stay built on sorrow. Sometimes the ground underneath a man's whole life turns out to be something better than he knew. Sometimes the woman whose name is carved in marble is standing in the next room, asking if you want more pepper in your soup. And sometimes, if you were the kind of boy who grew into the kind of man who built something real from love, that is exactly enough. If this story moved you, tell us in the comments where in the world you are watching from. And subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you will not want to miss.